I'm going to start today with a little bit of a review of something that we talked about sort of earlier when we were doing syntax, because it came in handy at a certain point. You guys were pushing me with questions about the fine details of syntactic structures, and I wasn't able to answer your questions without making reference to another kind of test for syntactic structure, which was binding theory. And so I showed you binding theory back then, but I'm going to go over it again in a little more detail, and we'll talk about some things that we didn't get a chance to talk about last time. And then we'll go on from there. Binding theory is the theory that's meant to handle facts like the facts that are on this slide, namely the fact that if you say that these are both grammatical sentences, but that they mean different things. The first one, Susan likes herself, you could paraphrase as Susan likes Susan. So herself has to refer to Susan. And possibly relatedly, Susan likes her. You don't know who her is, but you do know one thing, which is that it is not Susan. That's not a general fact about her. It's a fact about her in this sentence. So if I said I like her, then her could be Susan, whoever Susan is. But if it's Susan likes her, then that her cannot be Susan, or at least not the same Susan as the subject. Yeah? Binding theory is meant to capture facts like this. And sort of, these starred sentences are sort of incorporate some of the things that I just said. Not only, so these little letters, these subscripts that people put on these words are meant to indicate things about what can co-refer with what. So Susan likes herself, the first sentence is okay, and the third sentence is starred, because if you say the string Susan likes herself, then Susan and herself have to refer to the same person. And we sort of indicate that by giving them the same subscript. Susan sub A likes herself sub A, that's okay, but Susan sub A likes herself sub B is not okay. Right? The two subscripts have to be the same. And with a pronoun, it's the other way around. They have to be different. Okay so far? Nobody is sitting there quietly thinking, no, wait, I say Susan likes her, and I mean Susan likes herself all the time. No wonder nobody ever understands me. Nobody's having that experience. Okay, good. So, you know, looking at this without thinking about it too hard, we could think, okay, maybe pronouns, we'll use pronoun to refer to words like her, cannot co-refer with anything in the sentence, right? Where co-refer means, you know, refer to the same person. And anaphors, which is a name for fancy words like herself, must co-refer with something. So Susan likes herself, herself needs to refer back to Susan. You have to give herself something for it to co-refer with. No? So, and you know, when we did binding theory before, we already got this far. A word like herself has this special property that it has to co-refer with something else in the sentence. But, you know, interesting fact, it can't just refer with anything. And this is why there's a theory. You have to do some work to figure out which kinds of things it can refer to. So Susan likes herself is fine, but Susan's father likes herself, where herself is Susan, is no good. You know, one hopes that Susan's father likes Susan, yeah, but this is not the way to say it. So herself can't refer back to Susan in a sentence like this, which sort of knocks out some of the simplest, easiest theories you might have had from the first sort of batch of sentences on the earlier slide. You know, you might have thought, well, you know, anaphors, they need to refer back to something, and you might even have thought they have to refer back to something that's, you know, earlier in the sentence, you know. They're kind of a pointer that points back to something that's before them. And what we're seeing is that it's more complicated than that. They can't just pick out anything. Yeah. There are some restrictions on what they can refer to. We have to understand what those are. There's a classic story, which we've already been through, I'll just show it to you again, about why it's okay to say Susan must like herself, but bad to say Susan's father must like herself. The classic story goes like this. What we're trying to do is come up with a structural relationship between Susan and herself that holds in the tree in the left, but not in the tree in the right. We're talking about structural relationships because, well, your first hope, which might have been, yeah, herself has to refer to something that's been mentioned before, you know, the way you might have hoped language was designed. There are no languages like that. There are instead languages like this that apparently care about trees when they're deciding which things can refer to to which other things. And so we're going to try to develop a structural distinction between the relationship between Susan and herself in the tree on the left and the relationship between Susan and herself in the tree on the right. As I said, we've talked about this before. We're just reviewing it. The story that people have classically come up with makes use of the fact that Susan is sort of more deeply buried in the tree on the right than she is on the left. So there's a relation called C-command, which says it's a relation that can hold between two nodes in a tree. It says alpha C commands beta if every node that dominates alpha dominates beta. So you C command basically the thing that you were merged with and everything that dominates. So in this tree, the NP Susan C commands herself. The way we find that out is we ask, what are the nodes that dominate the noun phrase Susan? And there's only one, that TP that I've put up there. And that TP also dominates herself. And so Susan C commands herself. Yeah. Does herself C command Susan? No. Yeah. You're all shaking your heads appropriately, right? And the way to find that out is to ask, what are the nodes that dominate herself? And they include that TP, but somebody name another one that doesn't dominate Susan. VP, yeah, or T-bar. Yeah. So there are at least those two, which dominate herself but don't dominate Susan. So Susan C commands herself, but herself doesn't C command Susan. And what we're seeing is that maybe an anaphor needs to refer to something that C commands it. So in this sentence, Susan must like herself. Herself is referring to Susan, and Susan C commands herself. As opposed to the other tree, Susan's father must like herself, which is no good. What's wrong with it? Well, what's wrong with it is, on this story, there are multiple nodes dominating Susan. There's, TP, but also NP and DP, and some of those don't dominate herself. So Susan doesn't C command herself. Yeah. Binding theory sort of makes use of this. Let me just call your attention, maybe your attention is already firmly fixed on this, call your attention to how weird this is. I just alluded to this, but let me just say it again. I'm showing you a bunch of facts about English, and different languages do have different anaphors that behave in different ways. But here's something no language ever does, as far as I know. There are no languages in the world where an anaphor can refer to anything that was said earlier. There are no languages in which both Susan likes herself and Susan's father likes herself, in which they're both okay. Right? There just aren't any languages like that in which the important thing is, does the noun precede the anaphor? Which is, so first of all, interesting. There aren't any languages like that. But second of all, sort of weirdly, surprisingly interesting. Let's get ourselves in the frame of mind where we can be impressed by a fact like that. Because look, imagine what you were like when you were a baby, right? Here you are, you've just been born, you're hearing people speak, right? They're saying sentences in this language that's going to be your native language. You're trying to learn it, you're trying to figure things out about it. What's the one thing that you know? You hear people talking, and they're saying things like, here, I'll put a sentence on the board in a language that I hope none of you speak. So here's a sentence. You hear one of your parents saying, umiinom ang lalaki ng tubig. For some reason, maybe they write it down and show it to you, so for some reason that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words long. What else do you know about that sentence? Do you know which words in that sentence C command, which other words? Good Lord, no. Yeah. Do you know which words in that sentence precede which other words? Yeah. Yeah. So you know that lalaki precedes tubig. You know that. Yeah. But you don't know whether lalaki C commands tubig or not. Yeah. So the one bit of information that you have immediately from the get-go, which words come before which other words, you ignore. Yeah. So languages don't ever make use of that when they're doing binding theory. Yeah. So you would have thought this one sort of easy to access bit of information that all of us have from day one, no matter, you don't know anything else about your language, you at least know which things come before which other things. Binding theory never ever cares about that. It only cares about C command, which is this thing that you have to know something in order to understand. It's kind of, it's as though our brains are designed to build language in some ways and not others. and to ignore certain sources of data which are very, very fruitful. You have lots and lots of data about which things precede which other things, but you don't care. It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Would that create, if for some reason we did care about the order of the words that were said, would that create ambiguity? Because some languages are like, is it German, that like half of it is head initial and half is head final? So you'd be like completely confused.
As to which things precede and follow which other things. I mean, there are ambiguities in binding theory. We've been talking about simple sentences so far, but you can say things like, if anybody is wondering, this is Tagalog, it means is drinking the man the water. So the man is drinking the water. Sorry, I just told you that so you wouldn't have to worry about that. There are ambiguities in binding theory. I've been talking about sentences where there aren't ambiguities, but you can say things like, Susan told Stacy about herself, where probably the easiest reading for that is that Susan told Stacy about Susan. But if Stacy is unclear about herself, there's something Stacy doesn't know about herself, Susan could tell Stacy about herself and have that mean Susan told Stacy about Stacy, I think. Am I making that up? I think that's true. This is just ambiguous, right? So here's a sentence. So we're okay with ambiguity usually. There are plenty of places where if we were to draw a tree for this, we'd want to draw a tree where Susan and Stacy both see command herself. And so it has a choice of which kind of thing it wants to refer to. All it cares about is which thing C commands it. But it doesn't care about which thing precedes it in any language on Earth. This is kind of interesting. Yeah, go.
I was also thinking about you could have something like, I don't know, Carrie likes Mary herself. Like maybe Mary played a really evil character on TV and
yeah.
people don't like her. She likes Mary herself.
Right.
But it's like all the other people hate Mary, but she herself.
She herself, yeah. You're raising, actually, I'm glad you asked that question because it raises a good point, which I should have made, and so thank you for raising it, which is that languages use herself, himself, myself, all these self kinds of doohickeys for a bunch of different things. We're going to be concentrating on the herself that sits where a noun phrase would normally sit and refers back to another noun phrase, right? But there is this other, it's sometimes called an intensive use of reflexives, and I can't spell today, intensive, where you say things like, John himself fixed the computer. Where, or for that matter, John fixed the computer himself. Where that means something not so different from John fixed the computer, right? It means something like John fixed the computer and no one else did. Yeah. Notice that, so like Susan's father must like herself. We were talking about things that herself can refer to, or Susan told Stacy about herself. We're talking about things that herself can refer to. This would be an okay sentence if you changed herself to something else. It would mean something else, but Susan told Stacy about Mary. That's also a sentence, right? So herself is just a noun phrase with special properties that's sitting where noun phrases go. If you replaced himself here with something else, so if it were John Mary fixed the computer, you would no longer be speaking English. Yeah. So this is a different construction, the construction that you're raising. A really interesting one, which I'm now going to ignore for the rest of today. But that's what this is. Yeah. Oh no, I'm ignoring you. No, sorry, go ahead. Sorry?
Is that another example of movement? Or
which one? Oh, the fact that himself can be either here or here? Maybe. We have to be careful. There are various kinds of, so himself here, it's kind of like an adverb, right? It's modifying the way in which he fixed the computer. And just as you can say things like John quickly, I don't know why I switched to John here. Let's make Susan do this too. Just as you can say Susan quickly fixed the computer or Susan fixed the computer quickly. You could do that with movement, or you could decide, we're learning something about adverbs, that adverbs, because it's an adjunct maybe, there are more options about where it can go. You know, the rules about where exactly it goes are not as strict. The clean arguments for movement are cases where we know for a fact that something should be here, and yet it's over here, right? And so that's when we do, like, what did he devour? That's what we're doing there. Yeah. Yes?
But doesn't the meaning of that sentence kind of change depending on where you put the herself? Like,
Oh, sometimes. Yeah.
like the first one, you have the herself after Susan, you're implying that it's like surprising that Susan herself was the one who fixed the computer.
Yeah.
Whereas if you put it at the end, you're just saying that it was Susan.
Yeah, so these might be different kinds of adverbs. That's a very good point. Yeah, that's a very nice point. So if I say Susan herself fixed the computer, we mean Susan is the CEO of the company. You would have expected her to hire someone else to do it, but she did it herself, right? Whereas Susan fixed the computer herself, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's surprising that she did it. It just means that she did it and no one else did. Yeah, right. So they're related meanings, but separate. So we may want to distinguish, you know, two different types of intensive modification. You're absolutely right. Nice point. Other nice points people wish to make? Yes?
So to clarify, the reason that this tree is not valid is that herself is looking for something to bind to.
Yeah.
And so it needs an entity to bind to.
That,
And it finds two entities. It finds Susan and it finds Susan's father. And it can't bind to Susan because of the C command constraint. It can't bind to Susan's father because father.
goes wrong gender.
Right.
Yep.
He himself.
Yep, yep, yeah, that's it exactly. So yeah, so the idea is, so we weren't asking why can't it refer to Susan's father, you just asked that question, and I think you answered it perfectly. Herself can't refer to Susan's father, which does C command herself because Susan's father is male, wake up. And it can't refer to Susan because Susan doesn't C command it. Back, good, yes. Yeah.
So then to clarify, if the sentence was Susan's father must like himself,
Mhm.
that's fine because Susan's father is the NP that's recommending.
Right, and that's my intuition about the sentence. Is that yours? And that would be okay. It means Susan's father has a healthy self-regard. Yeah. Yeah? Okay, cool. So binding theory, I introduced you to binding theory as a test for structure, right? So once we are willing to trust binding theory at least a little ways, we can convince ourselves that we have a new way of finding out things about structure. We know we have the right structure if we have the right C-command relations to get the binding relations that we seem to find. Yeah. So for example, when we're thinking about sentences like this, Susan told Stacy about herself, we're going to need it to have a structure in which Susan and Stacy both C-command herself. Right? And so when we were talking before about complicated verb phrases, binding theory is the kind of thing that people use as a probe into the structure of complicated verb phrases. Okay. So, all right, so one part of binding theory is going to say anaphors, these are words like herself or myself. In English, they all end with self. They need to be C-commanded by something that co-refers with them. And then we have a short name. I hope I do this on the next slide. I'm not sure if I do or not. We have a short name for to C-command something that you co-refer with. We call that bind. So we say that, you know, Susan told Stacy about herself. Herself needs to be bound. And there are two noun phrases that could bind it, Susan and Stacy. Yeah. And so we need a structure for this in which those both C-command herself. And either of them could co-refer with herself. Yeah, Faith?
Do all anaphors like necessarily end in self, or are there like cases where pronouns act as anaphors? So for example, like John said he went to the store, or he is referring to John.
Yeah, that's a very nice point. So far you may have noticed all of my examples have only been one clause long. We're going to make things more complicated in just a second. But here, just to get started on making things more complicated, we've been talking about the fact that you can say Susan must like herself. If we make this an embedded clause, so if we say Mary thinks Susan must like herself, well, herself can refer to Susan, but it can't refer to Mary. So Mary thinks Susan must like herself. And that's not going to be because Mary doesn't C-command herself. It does in the kinds of trees that we're drawing. So you are finding a complication which I was planning to hide for a few more slides. There's an additional requirement on anaphors. They don't just need to be C-commanded by something that co-refers to them. They don't just need to be bound. They need to be bound by something that's sufficiently close. And if they're in different clauses, they're not sufficiently close. And we'll talk about that soon. You'll get to look back with nostalgia on this little interchange in just a few minutes. Raquel.
This isn't really a question, but I think it's interesting that like co-reference could create sort of a presupposition, like like the magician, the magician made herself disappear. It's like, okay, well suddenly the fact that the magician is female is a presupposition that's just sort of there. But
Yeah.
you could be wrong when you couldn't start necessarily because you're not sure.
Yeah. No, I take your point. So I take your point to be, if you say the magician made herself disappear, or the magician made her father disappear, whether you use an anaphora or a pronoun. Magician doesn't have any information about gender in it, but a thing about pronouns and reflexives in English is that they carry presuppositions about the gender of their reference. That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's quite true. Yep. Okay. All right. So good. I did say it on the next slide. Bind. This is just a name for C-command and co-refer with. Just because we get tired of saying C-command and co-refer with, we say a alpha binds beta if alpha C-commands and co-refers with beta. So in Susan must like herself, Susan binds herself. Susan co-refers with herself, and it C-commands herself. And anaphors need to be bound. And thanks to Faith, you know that pretty soon it's going to be more complicated than that. They need to be bound by something that's sufficiently close to them. Yeah.
Speaking about behavior of C-command.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier in the semester how normal pronouns are not AC-commanded.
Yeah, so we're going to do pronouns next. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're going to get to that. Actually, I think we're doing it next. Anaphors must be bound. Okay, sorry, one more thing. There are two kinds of anaphors. There are reflexives, which are the ones we've been concentrating on, words like herself and himself. And then there are what are called reciprocals, which have the same behavior. They're words like each other. So John and Bill like each other. The meaning of each other is much more complicated than the meaning of themselves. But each other and themselves have the same behavior in that they are okay in sentences like John and Bill like each other, or themselves, and that they are both bad in John and Bill's father likes each other, or themselves. So each other and themselves are both anaphors, and they're both subject to this requirement that they be bound. Yeah? Each other, so John and Bill like each other means something like John likes Bill and Bill likes John. Yeah? There's a literature on exactly what reciprocals mean, because it's complicated. For example, it's possible to say things like, we piled the books on top of each other. So each other doesn't mean for every pair in the group, A relation B and B relation A, right? You might have thought looking at this that John and Bill like each other. To interpret that, what you do is you take all of the pairs you can make out of the group. Okay, there's one pair, And what this means is John likes Bill and Bill likes John. But if you say the books are piled on top of each other, it doesn't mean, this book is on top of that book and this book, right? That's not what it means. So there's work on trying to figure out what the heck it means, what reciprocals mean exactly, which we will not get any further into. Yeah. Okay, this was Joseph's question. Pronouns. Anaphors must be bound. Pronouns must be free. It sounds like a political slogan, but it's a fact about grammar. Yeah. Pronouns need to not be bound. So Susan likes herself is fine. Susan's father likes herself is bad. That's the behavior of anaphors, which we're familiar with by now. And her behaves the same way, only backwards. Yeah. So Susan likes her. Fine sentence as long as Susan and her are different people, right? So her can't be bound by Susan. Yeah. It can't be C-commanded by Susan if Susan and her are going to refer to the same person. On the other hand, Susan's father likes her. Fine. Yeah. Okay. So. It's not quite true, but it's almost true that anaphors and pronouns are in complementary distribution with each other. So for a given meaning, you either use the pronoun or you use the anaphor. Yeah. Okay? Okay. More examples. Even more examples. Okay, so now we're getting to Faith's point. So, or my version of Faith's point. Sorry, Faith. So Susan likes herself. we've seen this is okay. Susan thinks I like herself, or I have on the sentence on the board, Mary thinks Susan must like herself. Herself is trying to get bound, in this case by Susan, on the slide by Susan, and it can't be. The kinds of trees we were drawing for this kind of sentence, Susan certainly does C-command herself. I don't think I put the tree on the slide, so let me just create it quickly. Susan thinks, there's going to be a CP here, the null C, and then down here we have a noun phrase I, and a verb phrase like herself. So if we ask ourselves, here's the tree, did I write the right sentence? Susan thinks I like herself, yes. If we ask ourselves, does Susan C-command herself? Well, the answer is yes. If we ask, what are the nodes that dominate the noun phrase Susan? Well, there's only one, it's this TP. Yeah? And so if we're asking, does Susan C-command herself? Well, we're really asking, does this TP dominate herself? And yes, it does. Yeah. So Susan C-commands herself. So it looks as though Susan ought to bind herself. What we're learning here is the complication that Faith made me reveal early, which is that not only do anaphors need to get bound, they need to get bound by something which is close enough. There's a principle, it's called principle A. You can think of A as standing for anaphor. It says anaphors must be bound within TP. If this were intro syntax, we would now spend weeks, possibly months, trying to figure out what the real locality requirement is, because it's more complicated than that. But that's close. Yeah. So the idea here is that herself, yes, it's bound by Susan in this tree, but it's not bound by Susan within the smallest TP. Here's the smallest TP that includes herself, and Susan is too far away. So there's a locality requirement. Yeah. Does that make sense? So principle A says anaphors need to be bound within the smallest TP that contains them. And then principle B, where B stands for the principle that comes after principle A, says pronouns must be free within TP. Yeah. So just as we saw before that pronouns and anaphors are so far in complementary distribution for a given reading, so you can say Susan likes herself, and that means that you can't say Susan likes her and mean the same thing that you mean with Susan likes herself. Similarly, we've now seen, thanks to principle A, that you cannot say Susan thinks I like herself, where herself refers back to Susan. And principle B says, yeah, pronouns have to be free within TP. So Susan thinks I like her, where her refers to Susan. Fine. It doesn't have to refer to Susan, right? It can refer to anybody. It can be free regardless of whether it's bound by Susan or not, free within TP. Yeah, Faith.
I may have just forgotten, but with that tree there, is the invisible like T that's dominated by the T bar always necessary, or could you just say like
this?
Yeah,
and also this? Yes, you know what? In most of the trees I've been showing you, I've been smart enough to put auxiliaries in the sentences. So I've been saying things like, Susan will think that I must like herself. And then people don't ask the question that you're asking. But when I drew this tree, I was not smart enough to do that. There does need to be a T, because why does there need to be T? Well, we have principles like the extended projection principle, which says that TP must have a specifier. And sentences without auxiliaries in them show the effects of that. So it doesn't matter whether there's an auxiliary or not. Yeah, it doesn't matter whether there's an auxiliary or not, you still get the effects of the extended projection principle. So we do want there to be a T because we want there to be a TP, and we don't have any way to make a TP without starting with a T, right? So you have to merge T with a verb phrase and so on. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not totally unhappy about the direction this conversation is taking because you are forcing me to talk about syntax, which is fine. Yeah, even though this is the semantic part of the story. Suppose I was smart enough to use an auxiliary here, so we'll do Susan will think, and we'll forget about the embedded clause for a second. We've talked about this, I think, that if you want to ask a yes/no question, the way to do it is to head move T into C. So you ask questions like, will Susan think that, blah, 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 blah. Now, so bear that in mind. And now let's switch to the version of this where there isn't an auxiliary. Susan thinks that I like. If I want to make a question out of that, what I do is I put does here, and I get rid of the S here. So it's does Susan think that, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So there's a story about what's going on here, which says what's in T. So there are various things that can be in T. There's will and should, might, and there's also s, as in Mary thinks that I like her. And if you do T to C of will or should or might, then you just move them over there and nothing else happens. If you have an s, then there are a couple things that happen. If you aren't head moving it, then it attaches to this verb, so you end up with Susan thinks. And we have to figure out how these two things come together to form a verb. And sadly, it's long enough since we did syntax that I'm unwilling to try to tell you that, right? There's a big literature on trying to figure that out. And then the other story is, if you're going to do T to C, if you're going to make a question, you're going to take this, it's not going to show up here, it's going to show up here. So you would have expected this to be Susan think I like herself, but is too small to be an English word or something like that. And so you put in this do. There's a process that is called do support. You add do there so that this will have a verb to be part of. It's the story that people tell. And so that's why the question version of that is, does Susan think that I like her? Can you see why I have been hiding all of this from you all semester? So I've been using auxiliaries instead of giving you verbs that have suffixes on them. This is why, yeah, because I didn't want to do this, but it's been fun anyway. But now it's over, except it's not. Joseph.
Just a brief question.
Yes.
About that movement. You said the extended projection principle requires TP to have a specifier.
Yep.
So that means that because in English, that like creating a yes or no question means moving ahead out of TP, you can't move Susan because then TP moves the specifier, right?
Yeah. Oh, I see.
Is that why?
No, no. Oh, you mean why are you moving the head? Why are you not moving a phrase?
Why can't you just move Susan up?
There isn't a deep answer to that question. Forming questions involves taking whatever's in T and moving it into C. You'd like to know why we don't move other things, and that's a good question. This is...
Moving the verb, and then say you can't do this because it's the shortest path.
Yes, I see, yes. So yeah, you can't take the verb and move it up there, that's right, because that's too long. Why can't you move this? Because it's not a head, it's a phrase. Apparently we think that only heads can move to attach to other heads. Yeah. And we might want to know why. There are lots of things we might want to know. Yeah. Go take syntax. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah? Okay. All right. This is all of you dragged me kicking and screaming into doing more syntax. Shame on you. Okay. Right. Principle A, principle B. Yes, people reasonably happy with principle A and principle B. So they say anaphors need to be bound within TP. Pronouns have to be free within TP. Side note, since I just told you universal about anaphors only ever care about C command. They never seem to care about like linear order. They don't care about what precedes them or follows them. I should say that there are points of variation between languages. There are languages that have anaphors that need to be bound, but they can be bound longer than this. So there are languages that have anaphors that can be bound outside of the TP that they're in, called long-distance anaphors. English doesn't have them, but Mandarin does, for example. So Mandarin Ziji is a long-distance anaphor. Languages, it's not principle A is not a parameter that distinguishes languages. It's a parameter that distinguishes anaphors. So Mandarin actually has two anaphors. It has an anaphor that behaves like this, which is pronounced ta ziji. And then it has another one that is long distance that can be bound from outside its TP. It's just ziji by itself. Those of you who speak Mandarin can be thinking about that. There are languages that have more anaphors than that. Korean, I think, holds the record. It has 4 different anaphors with slightly different behaviors. Yeah?
Do languages that have long-distance anaphors also always have like this type of anaphor, or does it vary?
As far as I know, Every language has this type of anaphor. And long-distance anaphors are an additional luxury that a language can allow itself or not. I don't think there are any languages that only have long-distance anaphors. Yeah, good question. Yep, okay. Okay, where are we? Okay, yes. So we have principle A, we have principle B. Anaphors need to be bound within TP, pronouns have to be free within TP, and let's stick to English again. Now let's consider these sentences. She likes Susan, and her father likes Susan. With these subscripts and these grammaticality judgments, which I hope everybody agrees with. So she likes Susan, fine sentence, but she and Susan can't be the same person. Yeah. Does either of our principles handle these facts? That's a leading question, if there ever was one. No, they do not. Yeah, so first of all, principle A is obviously going to be useless here. There are no anaphors in these sentences. Okay, so forget principle A. Principle B, pronouns need to be free within TP. Well, is she free within TP and she likes Susan? Is there a noun phrase that C commands she and co-refers with it? Is she free? Yes, she is free. Shall I draw a tree? She, what's the sentence? She likes Susan. Someday, I'm going to ask somebody to make me a stamp, a chalk stamp, that just has this tree, TP, T-bar, B, wham. And then there it would be. That would be great. She likes Susan, yeah? Here's the pronoun. Pronoun needs to be free within TP. That is, there had better not be anything C commanding she that co-refers with she. Does anything C command she? I guess maybe T-bar. Yeah. So T-bar is dominated by all the same nodes as noun phrase. But T-bar doesn't refer to she, doesn't refer to Susan. So she is free, yeah? So our principles don't handle these facts. There are at least two things we could do. One would be to say, principle B, we were wrong to confine principle B to pronouns. So it's really just a distinction between anaphors and everything else, right? So the problem with she likes Susan isn't she, it's Susan. So Susan also needs to be free within TP. Yeah? And then the story would be her father likes Susan, her is embedded inside her father, and so doesn't C command Susan, and so there. Yeah? That version of principle B would cover this. But pronouns really are the opposite of anaphors. They need to be free within TP, so Susan thinks I like her, where Susan C commands her and co-refers with her, so Susan binds her, is fine because although her is bound, it's bound by something that's far away. And that's all right. But in she thinks I like Susan, we're seeing that names do not behave like pronouns. Susan requires absolute freedom, freedom everywhere. Pronouns just need to be free within a certain domain, within TP, let's say. But a name like Susan needs to be free everywhere. The fact that Susan is bound by she in that second example, she thinks I like Susan, means that the sentence is bad. It doesn't matter that they're far apart. No? So we make up a new principle. It's called principle C. And also a new term, R expressions. R expressions means things that are not anaphors or pronouns. It stands for referring expressions, which is an unfortunate name because they don't necessarily refer, Susan does, it refers to Susan, but anyway, that's all it means. Things that are not anaphors or pronouns. So, everything that isn't subject to principle A or principle B is subject to principle C, every noun phrase. That isn't subject to principle A or principle B is subject to principle C, which says our expressions must be free everywhere. Yeah. Our expressions must be free, and everywhere they are in chains. Yeah, okay? All right. And then this is the fact that I made a big deal about before. you know, even though which thing precedes which other thing is the kind of thing that every infant knows as soon as they can hear words and segment words, which infants are eerily good at. Even though, you know, if you were going to design a computer, you know, a language for computers to use, I am not a computer person. You may have picked up on this. Even I think it would be easier for me to get a computer to figure out which thing linearly precedes which other thing, than it would be to get a computer to figure out which thing commands which other things. And that's a much more complicated task, it seems to me. Not that I know anything about this stuff. And yet, all of us go for the more complicated task. We're built that way. We can't help it. Yeah, so language doesn't care which thing precedes which other thing. It cares which thing commands which other thing. Always, in every language, over and over again. Yeah?
How do we draw a tree when the subordinate phrase is first?
Oh, well, we could do it different ways. Where will I put this? I'll put it up here. So maybe you would start by drawing the TP first. So Susan read a book. Right? Do that for Susan read a book. And then we need somewhere to hang while she was eating. And we need it to be some kind of adjunct, right? So it's not in the same kind of relation as anything else. It's not, what am I trying to say? It's not selected by anything, right? There's no particular reason for it to be anywhere. So there are various ways we could do that. Notice, for example, that if this were an embedded clause, so if it were, I think that, so here's a C, right? It's going to be a CP. Yeah, so, sorry, this is a CP. So if we were doing, I think that Susan read a book, the embedded clause that Susan read a book would look like this, right? It would have a CP here. I can just connect these. Have a CP with a C that's got this TP as its sister. Yeah. And if we were going to add this embedded clause, this adjuncty clause to the beginning of the embedded clause while she was eating, I think one place let's think about places to put it. If it's going to be before Susan, we could ask, does it go here or does it go here? So I think that while she was eating, Susan read a book, is I think something that we can say. I think while she was eating that Susan read a book, I think does not mean the same thing. There's something wrong with that. So this is at least one place that it can go, right? Between the C and the TP. And given that it can go between the C and the TP, maybe the easiest thing to do would be to just make it an adjunct on TP. So we'll have another, we'll duplicate the TP node, and we'll have a CP here, where I won't do the insides of it, but that's where you would put while she was eating. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, so that's binding theory. I think I flagged the fact there are many, many things to say about binding theory. That's part of it. Reasons to be happy about binding theory. I first showed you binding theory as a probe into C-command relations, but there's so much more. There are lots of things we can do with binding theory. Let me show you one. Here's a sentence. Mary decided to leave. Yeah, fine sentence. How many TPs are in this sentence? Well, there's at least one. What's to leave? To isn't a preposition here. This isn't like Mary went to Toledo. Yeah. In fact, this to is in complementary distribution with a bunch of different things. You can't say, for example, you can say Mary decided to leave. You can't say Mary decided will leave or should leave. Or, for that matter, Mary decided left. Yeah? These are not sentences. Yeah, so these are all bad. Which makes people think that maybe to is the same kind of thing as will and should. Right, so here's a spot where you can only have one of these things. You can have will, or you can have should, or you can have to. Yeah? And so people think, yeah?
Is to not like joined with the verb itself though, like as part of the infinitive?
I don't know. This gets into questions about whether you believed your English teacher when she told you that he told you that you cannot say things like, Mary decided to immediately leave. Or we decided to boldly go where no one has gone before. Yeah. There are languages in which the infinitive is a morpheme that's attached to the verb. The marker of the infinitive is a morpheme that's attached to the verb. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But in English, it's not so clear that it is. There's stuff like adverbs that you can put between the to and the verb. At least I can. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Joseph?
Is the to shorthand for like that she would? Or
Well, so this sentence means more or less the same thing as Mary decided that she would leave. But again, so interesting fact, you can't have a that if you're going to have a to. Yeah. And if you don't, if you have a that, then you cannot have a to. If you have a that, then you can have all these other things that would be here if to were not here. You could have a will or a should or a past tense or right, all of these other things. That's the relation that we talked about in terms of selection. We said C selects T. T is selected by C. So these are all reasons to think maybe that to is a T. Yeah. There are two TPs in this sentence. Yeah, there's Mary decided to leave, that's one TP, and that to leave is another TP. Okay? You buying this? You should. Yeah. Okay. So maybe there are two TPs. But if there are two TPs in this sentence, we have this principle, the extended projection principle, that says every TP must have a specifier. But we only seem to have one subject, Mary, yeah, who's doing the deciding. Now, there's a classic answer to this question, which says, English is a language with many pronouns, and one of them is invisible. And the invisible one is the one that is the subject of leave. It's the thing that's satisfying the EPP here. So it isn't that TP doesn't have a specifier in to leave. That TP does have a specifier. It's just an invisible specifier. Yeah. When this theory was first offered, it was, people reacted the way you might expect them to, sort of the way some of you possibly mentally are, namely, come on, you're just trying to avoid having to say that the EPP is not right, or parameterize the EPP to different kinds of positions. But actually, binding theory gives us some reasons to believe that there is such a thing as pro. Let me show you some of the arguments. So in this case, that's a story that says, no, the EPP is being satisfied in the embedded clause by an invisible pronoun that refers, in this case, to Mary. Here are some data. John promised Mary to defend himself. John promised Mary to defend herself. John told Mary to defend himself. John told Mary to defend herself. Sentences with grammaticality judgments. I'm going to copy these sentences onto the board because I want to do various graphic things with them. And while I'm copying them, I'll ask you to look at those sentences and ask yourself whether you get these judgments. So John promised Mary to defend herself, himself. I put those in the wrong order? Yes, I did. And then John told Mary to defend himself. Herself, where the middle two, so this is bad and this is bad. Yeah. Do people get these judgments? Is this true? Am I just making this up? Nobody wants to protest? Okay. So, I told you before, binding theory, we're going to use binding theory to find things out about how far away things are, which things sequence which other things. Now that we have this theory that we hope is more or less reliable, we know when we look at an anaphora, it had better have an antecedent that's close enough to it, and we think that close enough is more or less within the same TP. Yeah. Now that I've done all that talking about anaphors, forget about the anaphors for a second. If I say, John promised Mary to leave, who's going to leave? John. And if I say John told Mary to leave, who's going to leave? Mary. Yeah. So the understood subjects of these embedded clauses, the pro, if there's a pro, is going to refer to John when the first verb is promised, but it's going to refer to Mary when, I'm just going to give it a subscript, Mary, when the first verb is told. Yeah? So let me do this the easy way first. If there is such a thing as pro, we ask ourselves, these anaphors, they need to get bound within the smallest TP, right, that contains the anaphor. And the smallest TP that contains the anaphor is going to be this. Yeah? And so when we ask ourselves, is the anaphor bound by a noun phrase that's close enough to it? Well, the answer is yes here, because himself gets to be bound by that pro, John. It refers to John. And so himself can be John. It can't be herself because the pro is John. It's not Mary. Whereas when the higher verb is told, then the pro is Mary, and so now himself is bad because himself can't refer to Mary, and herself is good. You can get bound by Mary. Yeah. So we can capture all of these facts if we're willing to posit a pro, which refers to who it should refer to, the person who's going to do the defending. Yeah. That'll depend on what the higher verb is. Interesting fact, which people work on, like what determines who pro refers to? Why is it John for promise, but Mary for defend? It's what's called subject control and object control. Yeah. But once we believe in pro, we have a handle on why the anaphors refer to who they refer to. Okay? Now let's do this the hard way. What if we didn't believe in pro? Well, if we don't believe in pro, what we want is for this position to be bound, to be bindable by John, right? But not by Mary. And we want this position to be bindable by Mary, but not by John. Okay. And this is going to be hard, right? The first one is going to be especially hard. So far, our conditions just say anaphors have to get secamended by something that's close enough to them. Yeah, to get that and co-refers with them. So, but if John is close enough to that anaphor position, well, then surely Mary is. Mary is closer. There's no way to do that. Have to come up with something very complicated. And the second set of examples is also going to be kind of hard because Mary is the object of told. Right? So, this anaphor will need to have a binding domain that gets up to the higher verb phrase, a domain in which it's anaphor. It finds a binder. It's going to need to find a binder in a domain. Okay, we have to say, okay, we were wrong about TPs. It's like the next verb phrase or something. The domain in which it finds a binder has to be this new special kind of domain that doesn't seem to be useful anywhere else. It's a mess, basically. And pro gets us out of the mess. We're willing to put pro in the places where we want to put it. Yeah. So one reason to be happy about binding theory is that it gives us a reason to make a move that we might have wanted to make anyway. These infinitives are acting like they have subjects. In two respects. They are satisfying the EPP, first of all, and they are acting like they have a subject that co-refers with somebody in the higher clause, either John or Mary, for purposes of binding theory. Binding theory is simplest if there is a pronoun there. Yeah. Now, minor problem, we can't see a pronoun there, but if we're willing to sort of rely on binding theory a little bit, we can use binding theory to convince ourselves that the pronoun actually is there. It's just that we can't see it. We have a new detector for pronouns. Yeah. We can find them this way. Does this make sense? Are all of you appropriately skeptical? Is anybody inappropriately skeptical? Do you have questions about any of this chain of reasoning? Is there reason to take seriously the idea that there are invisible pronouns sometimes? We talked about invisible pronouns before, I think. I think I gave you examples like, I can say, defend yourself. Yeah? Somebody said, I think somebody said that they were taught in school, I can't remember who it was, that the subject of an imperative is understood as you, right? That this means you defend yourself. And one reason to take that seriously is that, an anaphor here is acting like there is a subject around, or at least another noun phrase around that refers to you. Yeah? Because defend yourself is fine, but defend myself, no good, right? No matter how much you might want to say it, that's not the way to say it. You say defend me. Yeah? It's acting like the subject is you. Okay, you can't hear it. You can't hear the you, but there's a you there. Yeah? You can use these anaphors to find it. Yeah? Same thing here. In John promised Mary to defend himself, there's a pronoun in the subject of defend. It's really, John promised Mary him to defend himself, right? And that him, that pro, is referring back to John. And John told Mary her to defend herself. That her is referring back to Mary. Binding theory tells us so. Yeah. Slide after slide after slide. Yes. Okay. Okay. Here's another reason to be happy about binding theory. Another thing that it teaches us. A new argument for something that I showed you an argument for before, and now I will show you a new argument, possibly a simpler argument. Actually, I should start with this one. Which picture of himself did John like best? First setup for the argument. Observation. John sure doesn't look like it C-commands himself. But John used to C-command himself. And apparently, principle A can be satisfied with nostalgia. Yeah? So it thinks back to the happy days when John used to C-command himself, back before you did WH movement, and it's satisfied. Yeah, principle A, it's easy going that way. So this starts off, right, with John liked which picture of himself best, right? Which picture of himself starts off as the object of like, and it WH moves. It becomes the specifier of CP. Shall I draw a tree for that, or is that clear? I'm sorry, those were yes/no questions with opposite answers. Who would like me to draw a tree for that? Yes? Okay, let me draw a tree for that. I'll hide these trees. So, stamp. John, yeah. Here's a noun phrase. I'm going to leave out best just because we don't need it. Here's a DP, which, and bar, picture, positional phrase of, and the noun phrase himself. Okay, so this is just John liked which picture of himself. We could put a best in here. I don't know why I left out best. We'll put it here. There. So John liked which picture of himself best. And then WH movement will take this noun phrase and move it to make it the specifier of a CP, which is up here. So now we have which picture of himself in the specifier of CP, and did ends up here because we've moved T to C and done do support, which is something that Faith made me talk about. Yeah? So which picture of himself did John like best? And which picture of himself, which I've spelled without the final H, just to give you an additional challenge, which picture of himself starts off as the sister of like, and WH moves and becomes the specifier of CP? Yeah, that's the derivation for that. And now, so fact, which we're going to have to get used to. After we do the movement, John no longer C-commands himself, right? What does John C-command? Well, John, we ask which nodes dominate John, and it's these nodes. So John C-commands its sister, and everything its sister dominates. So John C-commands, like which picture of himself best, but which picture of himself has moved out of that domain? It's up here. Apparently, the fact that himself used to be down here in a position that John could see command is good enough. It's a phenomenon called reconstruction. It's as though when you are evaluating things for binding theory, you get to rewind the tape a little bit. Think, oh yeah, this used to be over here. That's good enough. Various ways to talk about that, but that's one. Okay? So file that fact. Yes, I just said that. Thank you. This phenomenon is called reconstruction. You treat something which is moved as though it hadn't. Okay. Now, let's think about longer, more complicated questions, like which picture did John think that Mary bought? So which picture has WH moved, right? But we talked about this question, about whether it has moved once in one mighty leap, started off as the object of buy and moved through all of that intervening material and became the specifier of the higher CP, or moved in a series of hops. Notice that John thinks that Mary bought a picture has two CPs in it. There's that Mary bought a picture, that's the embedded clause, and then there's the matrix clause. And we raised the question, and I gave you all of these Dinka facts that were meant to get you to take seriously the possibility that the second picture is the right one, that movement is what it's called successive cyclic. That is, you move in short hops, you don't move in mighty leaps. So WH phrase, it's not just that it likes to move to the specifier of CP, it likes to land in every specifier of CP that it can find along the way. It moves in this series of short hops. And I gave you some Dinka facts that were meant to get you to take that possibility seriously. Here's another set of facts that might also get you to take that possibility seriously. Think about a sentence like, which picture of himself did John think that Mary bought? First of all, it's fine. Do people agree? So himself can refer to John. All right, now let's think about why it's fine. Which picture of himself starts off as the sister of buy, right? Starts off in the embedded clause. And it ends up, well, in the position where it's pronounced, in the matrix clause. Is himself bound by John in the position where it's pronounced? Like the specifier of the highest CP? Does John see command that position? No, right? Shall I draw a tree for this? Would that be a good thing to do? Let's draw a tree. Which picture of himself did John think that Mary bought? Here's John. Think. Here's a CP. That. Here's a TP. Mary. Here's a T, and here's a VP. And then bought. And so we start off with which picture, which I'm running out of room, so I'm going to use a triangle. Here's which picture. I'm going to use a triangle, and I'm going to abbreviate picture as pick. And the question we're asking ourselves, and so here's the tree we start off with, yeah? Anybody wish to object to any aspects of this tree? Is this OK? All right, so, and the question we're asking ourselves is, this noun phrase, does it move just once to here? So we have which picture of himself, bless you. Does it move just once, or does it stop along the way here? That's the question we're asking ourselves. And now we're going to use binding theory to come up with the answer. Ready? Does John see command himself here? No. Yeah, I just said no before I drew the tree, but now that I've drawn the tree, you can see that the answer is, in fact, no. Yeah, so John doesn't see command this position. Does John see command himself when himself is down here? Yeah, right? So what's the see command domain for John? Well, it's its sister, that T-bar, this T-bar here, and everything this T-bar dominates, so all of this. So John see commands this position himself. Could John bind, is this just reconstruction? Can John bind this position? No, it's too far away, right? And so we can see that here. You can't say John thought that Mary bought a picture of himself. So this position is too far away, and this position John doesn't see command. If these are the only positions, then we are doomed. Yeah? Himself can't be bound happily in either of those positions. Doomed. But if which picture of himself spent some time here, well, then John see commands himself when which picture of himself is here, right? This is inside this T-bar, John's sister. Yeah, it's dominated by all the same nodes as that dominate John, and it's not contained in any TP that excludes John. Remember, our conditions on how far away things can be and still bind say that anaphors need to have binders that are contained in all the TPs that contain them, right, that aren't excluded by any TPs. So if we do successive cyclic movement, which Dinka already told us that we should, if movement happens not in one big jump, but in two small jumps, then we have an account of this, the fact that this sentence is okay. Yeah. This sentence is okay because himself, yes, it's been here, yes, it's up there, but it's also been here. Yeah. And the fact that it spent time here is why the sentence is okay. Yeah. Binding theory gives us a new reason to believe that. Yeah. Cool. So some of the cool things binding theory is for. Yeah?
So it's like you're going to go to multiple museums in one day, you do like a little stamp in the museum, and
Yes.
so at the end, you look a little bit different, multiple stamps,
Yes.
to show that you've been to multiple museums.
Yes. Yes, it's just like that, yes. Yes, yes. So himself has been here, and it's been up there, but it's also been here, and the fact that it was here meant that it got to go see the T-Rex skeleton, yeah, while it was here. Yeah? Okay, cool. So movement is successive cyclic, new reason to believe that. We have 15 minutes left. And I don't think I can do this next thing in 15 minutes. It involves guards. No, maybe I can. Let's start at least, and then this will give you something to think about until we get to Thursday. So consider this sentence: 2 guards seem to me to be standing in front of every building. Is that ambiguous? Yeah, it's ambiguous in the familiar way, right? It either means each building is guarded by 2 guards, as far as I can tell, or there are 2 really weird guards. Yeah, we're guarding all the buildings at once. Yeah, it has those readings at least. How about this sentence? 2 guards seem to themselves, sorry. 2 guards seem to themselves to be standing in front of every building. This is not ambiguous. This means that there are 2 guards who need to be taken off duty. There are 2 guards who are having hallucinations of being very, very large. Yeah? That's what this sentence means. It doesn't mean, and there's something else it could mean, right? It could mean this building has 2 guards who think that they're standing in front of it. That building has 2 different guards who think that they're standing in front of it. That building has 2 other guards who are standing in front of it. In a sense, the reading that it actually has is the more reassuring one. It just means that there are 2 guards who really need a psych profile. Whereas in the other reading, there are, however many buildings there are times 2. There are that many guards who are in psychological trouble. Yeah. So it doesn't mean all of the things that it could mean. And you might be able to guess, the problem is themselves. That's what's going to prevent the other reading. Yeah. But for reasons of time, let's let it prevent the other reading on Thursday. Yeah. So come back on Thursday, and I'll finish this point, another thing that binding theory is for. We'll talk a little more about reconstruction, exactly what it is, because it's fascinating. There's a lot of really cool work on trying to figure out what the heck it means. Okay, questions about anything else? All right, good. Go forth and think about linguistics.